that we saw before the crisis, that was by the brute force of events corrected during the most hectic days of the crisis, is now back. And if that complacency prevails, I am afraid that we will have to go through more drama, through more shocks, through more pain, before we start not only talking but acting seriously about building the kind of global governance that we need if we really believe that an interdependent world, as the one we have building, I would say with reasonable success, is going to prevail. Otherwise, dear friends, again, paraphrasing Ken Rogoff's and Carmen Reinhardt's title, well, we will prove ourselves that this time is not different. There we go again, and we will be facing a very dramatic failure for failing to build those global public goods that are urgently needed but are nowhere in sight in its process of construction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernesto, very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have, before going to the questions, we have, by order of appearance, 2 minutes of rebuttal, and it's a choice. Who wants to have 2 minutes of rebuttal or adding? No?
I want to.
Yeah, but by order of appearance. So
yeah, I know.
Okay.
But don't
François?
put me in the list.
No, I would like simply to stress the importance of the reference made to the global imbalance issue. And as Ernesto just said, I think it is quite telling that in 2006, the IMF was officially in charge of this multilateral surveillance of exchange rates, which basically was the global imbalance issue, and basically never did anything. And it never did anything. Why? Simply because the political power of the actors in that game is simply too big. So from that point of view, it is quite clear that an institution like the fund is powerless when we deal with coordination of policies. And of course, the problem that this issue is far from being over, and we are all afraid that bad things may happen again. The second point I wanted to make is about this point by both Santiago and Alan, about the self-insurance of many emerging countries that protected them to a large extent of the hardship that this crisis could have brought. The point is simply that there is a cost to that self-insurance, and we should not ignore the cost. And if we go further, there is a need for insurance, and there is a burden to be paid for that insurance, and there is an issue in the way in which that burden is shared. And we cannot dismiss that view. Certainly it is something that we have to discuss. I mean, we cannot say that it's a good thing that those countries were protected by a huge mattress of foreign reserves if they could have used these reserves in a very different way.
Okay. Padma, you want to use 2 minutes?
2 minutes?
No, 2 minutes, yes.
Yeah. I agree with Ernesto that there is more globalization, therefore we do need more global governance. But I think there is a difference between what is desirable and what is feasible. And that is what we are facing. And I believe that the lead has to come from the United States in this respect. And will that come? That is the big question in my head. And if the regulatory proposals, some of which I discussed, are implemented, watered down as they are, and they'll be watered down more in the Senate, if they are implemented, there is a chance that the oscillation next time or the occurrence of a financial crisis will be less than earlier. But the point made by Alan about the global balances, more saving from the United States households, there is a huge cultural factor here. I mean, Korean, Indian, Chinese households save about 25% of their take-home pay. Not American households who even just save from their take-home pay. Maybe they will improve as a result of some better tax policies. A value-added tax with the European countries have 20 to 25% of value-added tax. Is it possible in the United States? I don't think so, because they regard it as a regressive tax. Finally, a point about global governance through the IMF. I think the IMF needs to be made more of an authority by restructuring the quotas in the IMF allocations. And who is ready for that? Are the European countries ready for watering down their quotas so the Chinese, Indians, and Brazil quota is raised? How can the IMF be made more effective? We have a global governance system, and here is where I will end.
Thank you. Santiago? Yeah.
Just 2 points very quickly. Not to fully agree on the point of self-insurance made by Francois. Precisely what you would like is a mechanism by which... It's difficult to tell exactly what is the optimal combination of self-insurance and outsourced insurance for macro risks. But clearly, there is a high cost when self-insurance is excessive because you have this very large accumulation of reserves by countries that have a very high opportunity cost in terms of other uses. Precisely, you have to induce countries to rely less on self-insurance and be able to use more automatic mechanisms of outside insurance, i.e. the IMF. But this will only happen if countries perceive that insuring themselves through the IMF is somewhat of a perfect substitute, not quite, but almost, than having self-insurance. And this requires, and this is my fundamental point, deep IMF reform, so that this is not discretionary, this is automatic, this is large, it's preventive, and it is timely. And unless that occurs, countries will not give away their own self-insurance.
Thank you. Alan, you want to...
Yeah, very briefly. I ran over time last time, but I agree very much with what Padma and Santiago just said. I mean, if we can lower U.S. consumption and hence private savings, then we will achieve this result, through a market reallocation, because that savings has to flow somewhere in the aggregate. And my hope would be that although the emerging markets will still be accumulating reserve assets, it will be offset by an accumulation of emerging market assets by the private sector in the rich countries, and I think that would be a beneficial solution. It doesn't assume the can opener of large multilateral action and coordination, which may or may not be forthcoming for the sad pessimistic reasons that Ernesto mentioned. But there is maybe a 5 to 10 percentage point blip in U.S. savings. If that persists or continues, we may see a fundamental realignment in private capital flows, and I think that would be a good thing.
Ernesto?
Well, let me start with this last point. I don't share Alan's optimism. I think, yes, we have seen an increase in the private sector's savings rate in the United States, but at the same time, we have seen a dramatic deterioration in the fiscal accounts of the United States. When we start to see a recovery in a more sustained way, I'm not so sure that the private sector will continue to finance, in the U.S., will continue to finance the U.S. fiscal deficit. And I think we are bound to a dramatic crowding out of emerging low savings rates, countries like Mexico or Brazil. It will not be a problem for China, because they save 50% of their GDP. But I think, at least speaking for my region, Latin America, we are going to have a hard time. Then that takes me back to Santiago's point originally, where he said, yes, we had better fundamentals. That's why we didn't that bad. Second, it helped us that there were resources available. Well, this thing, forget about it if this scenario materializes. But I would also suggest that one factor that explains why countries like Brazil